these sacrifices we talk about in a metaphorical sense, they always have to do with losing something. Now, it's a lot of times for a higher purpose or for some higher goal, but it's always about loss, about hardship, about difficulty. In the ancient world, and in the Bible, when they talked about sacrifice, it reflected joy instead of that kind of gloominess and negativity.
Well, hey everyone, what is up? Welcome back to my channel. My name is Austin, and this is Gospel Simplicity, a place where we seek to bring simplicity out of theological and historical complexity. Today, I'm joined by Father Jeremy Davis, an Orthodox monk, and we are talking about the concept of sacrifice, specifically this idea that in order to understand Christ's sacrifice, we must understand Old Testament sacrifice, ancient Israelite sacrifice, and even the broader context of ancient Near Eastern sacrifice. Spoiler alert, I think a lot of us have, if not an entirely faulty, perhaps a limited view of sacrifice that is keeping us from maybe appreciating what sacrifice is in terms of Christ's sacrifice on the cross and what sacrifice means in our daily life. It's quite understandable that we might have a limited perspective on this, considering, I don't know about you, but I don't know too many people that engage in actual ritual sacrifice, so I don't have much of a point of contact with that in my life. You probably don't either, I hope. Anyway, I hope that you guys enjoy this video. It was an absolute joy for me, and we also talk about his children's book a bit, The Cellarer's Celery, which, I don't know, just the idea of an Orthodox monk writing a children's book makes me so excited. There's so much I could say about this. I'm interested in doing a video on Christian children's books. Are you interested in that? It sounds fun to me. Let me know if you're interested in that. Also, if you're wondering why I'm back to the old mic setup, I'm getting ready to move and all my stuff is in boxes, and this is what I could find. All that being said, I hope you guys enjoy the video, and I am so out of it. Thanks to my patrons. You guys are the best. If you want to support the channel, patreon.com/gospelsimplicity. Okay, video here. Well, today I am joined by Father Jeremy Davis. Father Jeremy Davis first encountered the Orthodox Church during his senior year of college. After a period of catechism, he was chrismated on Holy Saturday in 1998. 3 years later, he entered St. Vladimir's Orthodox Theological Seminary, and in 2004, he received his Master of Divinity degree. 2 years after his graduation, he was ordained a deacon after spending time on a mission in Australia with the Antiochian Archdiocese of Sydney. That same year, he was ordained a priest. In 2017, he was elevated to the rank of Archimandrite by His Grace Bishop Basil. Father Jeremy Davis is a tonsured monk belonging to the monastic brotherhood of St. Silouan the Athonite. He is the author of a children's book, The Cellarer's Celery, tongue twister there, and the new book, which we'll be discussing today, Welcoming Gifts, Sacrifice in the Bible, and Christian Life. Father Jeremy, thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me.
Well, it is my pleasure, and I want to just start off by asking, what inspired you to write about this topic of sacrifice?
Well, I think it was in my mid-20s that I decided to read the Old Testament from start to finish. And when you do that, you end up reading a lot of things that you missed, along the way. And I was surprised as I read descriptions of sacrifices that they didn't match up to the sort of idea or theory of sacrifice that I had learned as a child. Like the explanation for sacrifices didn't seem to fit what I was actually seeing in the pages of Scripture. And so that left just like a bee in my bonnet, so to speak, just kind of buzzing around thinking like, what is this thing, sacrifice? Eventually, I started reading books, different kinds of studies on it, and just searching for an answer to that pressing question. It's an important question because, it's not just about the Old Testament, but it's about Christ and what he did for us, and which is based in those Old Testament sacrifices.
That's wonderful. And I think that connection is something that you play out really well in the book. And so you close the preface to your book with this wonderful line that I wanted to highlight here. You write, "In the ancient world, sacrifice exuded a fragrance of exuberant joy. spontaneous gratitude, and even seductive charm. Today, it reeks of violence and suffering. No longer a silver lining, it is now a cloud. Could you elaborate a bit on how our current understanding of sacrifice, at least at a popular level, diverges from the biblical account of sacrifice?
Certainly. So, today sacrifice is like a really gloomy subject. That's why I said it's like a cloud. And we often, kind of avoid the idea of sacrifice, though we talk about it often. It's a strange kind of mixed up thing. But sacrifice for today for us is about suffering. It's about violence. It's about loss. When we think about ritual sacrifices, just even saying that word ritual sacrifice just kind of sends a chill down your spine. We tend to think more about human sacrifice even than animal sacrifice. And so it's a really kind of gruesome topic for us, ritual sacrifices. And then when we talk about sacrifice as a metaphor, which is what we more often do, talking about like the soldier's sacrifice or a mother's sacrifice for her children, or a father's sacrifice for his children. These sacrifices we talk about in a metaphorical sense, they always have to do with losing something. Now, it's a lot of times for a higher purpose or for some higher goal, but it's always about loss, about hardship, about difficulty. In the ancient world, and in the Bible, when they talked about sacrifice, it reflected joy instead of that kind of gloominess and negativity. In fact, sacrifices were often associated with feasting and celebrations. So much so that the Greek philosopher Plato worried that young people would sort of lose their moral compass by overindulging in sacrifice. He called it, in fact, a childish pastime of pleasures, which is just really, I think, enigmatic of how different their view of sacrifice was from ours, and their feelings towards sacrifice were from ours.
Yeah, I think that quote there is, or that idea is such a great way to showcase this wide gap that exists between our idea of sacrifice and theirs, that they would see sacrifice as something that is a pleasure and something to be enjoyed, whereas for us, that image you use of a cloud, I think is really apt. I think because many of us probably don't do our morning devotionals in Leviticus, we don't have the strongest sense of sacrifice, whether in the ancient world or in the ancient world broadly or in the ancient Israelite world specifically. You start your book by giving some background on ancient Near Eastern sacrifice and the way it was conceived of, which you've already hinted at a bit here. You offer kind of three ideas that I think might be helpful, though, to get into in specific. And that is these three categories. And that is sacrifice of food, aroma, and gift. Could you break this down a bit for us and how that might help us understand ancient sacrifice?
Certainly. So almost all ancient sacrifices were gifts of food to divine beings. So obviously in ancient Israel, there were gifts of food to Yahweh. Outside of ancient Israel, there are gifts of food to Zeus or Hera or Apollo or what have you. And sacrifices as gifts of food, that was a common theme throughout the Near East, really throughout ancient cultures throughout the world. It's even seen in, this is a terrible word, primitive cultures today, but sort of more traditional, pre-modern cultures in Africa or Asia. These same kind of practices of offering food gifts to divine beings. That is a common religious practice. In fact, in the ancient world, it was the primary ritual, the primary means of religious worship. even more important than prayer, for example. I mean, we think of prayer as being the most important facet of worship, but for ancient people across the world, it was sacrifice. And so when I say gifts of food to the gods, these could be given to the gods in various ways, most commonly by either displaying them before the god's idol. It's kind of a display offering. And that sort of offering is reflected in the ancient Hebrew tabernacle with the showbread, the bread that is set out in the tabernacle and then left out for a time, taken and then eaten by the priests. And likewise, in ancient Mesopotamia, gifts of food would be set out before the idols of their pagan gods, and then later consumed by the priests, but sort of presented as a symbolic meal. Or more commonly, like in Greco-Roman sacrifice, portions of the food, whether it be meat from an animal or, vegetables, fruits, baked goods, a portion of that would be burned on an altar so that the smoke would rise up to heaven, symbolically being sent to the gods. And then the remainder would be eaten by the worshipers in a meal of sort of religious fellowship. That same idea is seen in the Hebrew Bible in many sacrifices that ended with a holy meal of fellowship amongst the Israelite worshipers. A portion was burned for Yahweh, other portions were given to the priests, and then the rest was consumed by the worshipers. And so as a gift of food, it represented hospitality. I mean, it's something that we see in our own lives. If we invite a guest into our home, especially an honored guest, we'll present them with a carefully prepared, beautiful, delicious meal as a way of showing them that we welcome them into our homes and into our lives. And this was symbolically a way to do this with God. Now, God, of course, doesn't need to eat. And it's not that the Israelites or even ancient non-Israelites thought that a God needed to eat. Maybe some of them did. But for the most part, that wasn't the point. The point was a meaningful gesture, a symbolic gesture of welcome and hospitality. And then aroma, that aroma idea is also has to do with hospitality. When you welcome guests into your home, you might light a scented candle, or have a fragrance or some way, make your home smell inviting. We also make our person smell inviting with perfume or cologne because, those are ways that we foster relationships. And likewise, ancient people in their worship, they would entice God or the gods into their lives using the savory smell of the meat and food burning on the altar. They talked about that as being an inviting smell that draws the attention of God. And then also, and especially through incense, the burning of incense was really a kind of sacrifice, but it was pretty much the only sacrifices that weren't food, but they had a similar rationale, like you are creating an inviting scent to welcome God into your life symbolically. And you mentioned that idea of gift, which was a huge sort of cultural system in the ancient world. This ceremonial gift exchange was a very systematic way of inviting others into friendship with yourself and then showing that you welcome their friendship. A gift that would represent the giver, symbolizing the giver's intention towards the other. When that was given, it would then be received, signifying that the friendship was received and accepted. And then later, the recipient would give their own reciprocal gift, a way of sort of continuing that relationship. And this gift exchange is continuous giving and receiving and re-gifting and re-receiving over and over again was a way that people used to cement their relationships. And these sacrificial gifts in the Old Testament, sacrifices are most commonly called gifts. That's the word that's used. These sacrificial gifts were a way symbolically to do that with God, giving God gifts that represented the worshiper and that signified that the worshiper wanted God in their life, that they wanted a relationship with God.
I think this idea of putting sacrifice within this more relational context, or specifically within this broader realm of hospitality, is really fascinating. It will probably be a paradigm shift for some people, which if they get nothing else, I hope they at least get that. But I think there's so much more that we can dive into here. And we've talked kind of broadly, both ancient Near East and Israel within that, right? As, kind of at a broad level here, which I think is great. And there's a lot of points of continuity there. But a kind of hermeneutic, I suppose you could say, that you give in the book is this idea of Israelite sacrifice as purifying an already existing practice. That sacrifice happened in the ancient Near Eastern world. They didn't come up with this, right? But they do kind of give somewhat of a unique take on it, but it has to be understood within their larger culture. And so if we want to zero in here a bit on Israelite sacrifice that we would see in the Old Testament, what are some maybe points of discontinuity between ancient Israel and their neighbors?
Yeah, so in the book, I point to the account of Cain and Abel as being the Bible's like original story of sacrifice. But it's interesting that the book of Genesis does not in any way suggest that Cain and Abel sort of like sat down and invented this practice. It just suggests that that was what you do. Naturally, they felt the need to give God a gift of gratitude and a gift of welcome and love. And I think that symbolizes and really ties into what we see throughout ancient cultures, that this practice of sacrifice is, like I said, worldwide. It is a common, fundamentally human practice. But from our biblical Christian point of view, we understand that humanity from the beginning, we were created good by God, but then we chose to abandon God. We chose to leave him behind. And then our lives, our cultures began to unravel and just kind of go in crazy, strange directions, which leaves us with the mess that we live in today, and all the problems associated with that. Likewise, because of human sin, sacrifice was distorted from that original sort of pure gift from the heart that just represented loving God and welcoming him into one's life. And in the, just to sort of maybe, I don't really dwell on this in the book, but in non-Israelite cultures, their sacrifice actually took some bizarre turns. First of all, bizarre from our point of view, bizarre from the biblical point of view, is the idea of having this sort of like gigantic pantheon of gods that you have to placate with sacrifice. And everything has the rock has a god, the river has a god, the mountain has a god. And so worshipers are constantly trying to figure out the right offerings to give to all of these different beings. And another distortion is like in some Greek accounts of sacrifice, like snakes are sacrificed. Snakes aren't good food, right? But someone got it in their mind that a certain god, was really into snakes. And so we have to offer him a snake and for him to pay us attention and to get along with us. And in some cases, the whole idea of food, which is obviously central to sacrifice, was lost when like whole animals were thrown into a fire, maybe even living were thrown into a fire. These were not common in Greco-Roman sacrifice, but there are occasional accounts of this, and it just gives that sense in which sacrifice was spinning out of control. On another level, sacrifice became an occasion for display, for ostentation. So in Greek accounts of sacrifice, the animal's horns were, gilded, like gold was put around the animal's horns, and jewels and fancy bangles and things to lead it in procession. And part of the point of that was to advertise the wealth of the person who was offering the sacrifice, and draw attention to what they were doing. And there would be inscriptions, like you go to ancient temples, and there is inscriptions all over the place of this person gave this sacrifice, and this person gave this sacrifice, and this, because people did it, again, not to draw God into their lives, but to make a show of their piety, their devotion, to make their name known. So really, these are all just kind of specific examples having to do with sacrifice of the more general problem of human sin. Then when Israelite sacrifice is initiated, it's important to recognize that in the Bible, it's not that the Jews sat down and said, okay, how are we going to fix this practice of sacrifice? How are we going to fix this ritual? But, God spoke to Moses and said, look, forget everything that you've been doing. This is how you're going to sacrifice. It ends up, the sacrifices that we read about in the Old Testament law end up being actually much more simplified. Obviously you're not going to offer sacrifice to the many gods, only to the one God. And because there's only one God, there's only going to be one place of sacrifice, the Jewish tabernacle. And then after the promised land was settled, then it was the temple in Jerusalem. Only certain kinds of sacrifices would be acceptable, and those had to meet stipulations and regulations, criteria that made sure that they represented the kind of offering that God wanted from people, not just material qualities, but that the characteristics of the sacrifices would represent the spiritual qualities that God wants people to show in relation to Him, so that they would be those kind of symbolic gifts that represented a pledge of faithfulness, a faithful friendship to God.
That's really helpful. Thank you for that. And it is, to me at least, fascinating to hear about these different cultures and how they, had their kind of interesting sacrificial practices. But I also want to be sensitive to maybe some of the audience that, if they watch my videos, they're probably interested in those things. But I want to bring back this idea, which I didn't highlight earlier, though I think you might have mentioned it at the very beginning, this idea that understanding ancient Israelite sacrifice is integral to understanding Christ's sacrifice. And we're going to make that turn here just shortly. But I want to delve just a touch more into Israelite sacrifice, because I think it's something that so many of us have such little background in. And I think our theology is hindered because of that. I mean, the Old Testament is the larger portion of our Bible. There's so much there. And for many of us, it's just this uncharted territory, and we don't really know what to do with it. So I think giving people a bit more detail on this can be helpful, and then I think that'll help them even more as we understand Christ's sacrifice. So one last question on ancient Israelite sacrifice is the three categories that you divide Mosaic sacrifice into. And this probably isn't original with you, right? It's in the text, but it's a helpful way of coming about it here. And so the three categories you give are whole burnt offering, the peace offering, and the sin offering. So what's the significance of this kind of three-tiered structure?
Well, yeah, it definitely is not original to me. It's in the scriptures, but it's even more clear in the writings of Philo of Alexandria, an ancient Jewish philosopher who commented, heavily on the Old Testament, and Philo makes the point that that these three categories cover all of the possible ways in which human beings naturally want to reach out to God. So the whole burnt offering represents a pledge of total devotion to God. And what that looks like in practice is that the entire offering was burned on the altar, was sort of conveyed to God. None of it was reserved for the worshiper. And so it's interesting, though, I mentioned before that one of the distortions of sacrifice that we see in Greek culture was throwing whole animals into the fire. And you might say, well, he's talking about a whole burnt offering. Isn't that the same thing? It's actually not. The whole burnt offerings in the Old Testament must be prepared as cuts of meat before all of the cuts of meat are put on the altar to be burned. So the animal was killed, first of all, off of the altar. I think sometimes when we think about sacrifice, we think about, putting the living animal up on the altar and then, killing it on the altar. That's not what happened. The animal was killed in the courtyard and then was butchered, and this is, again, we kind of like horrified, like, oh, butchering an animal. Well, how do you think that the steaks end up in the supermarket? Exactly the same way, so the animal has to be butchered into cuts of meat, and then those cuts of meat were burned on the altar. And in the whole burnt offering, all of them were burned together on the altar to represent this like extravagant display of total devotion to God, not reserving anything for oneself. And remember that an animal in the ancient world was a very expensive commodity. It was a luxury. Meat was a luxury, in fact. But giving a whole animal and all the meat to God represented just how important God was in one's life. So the whole burnt offering represents the expression of total devotion to God. It was therefore considered to be the epitome of sacrifices, the highest sacrifice. The peace offerings encompassed offerings basically in thanksgiving to God for blessings that he had given. There were different variations on this, but mostly it was because God had done something for me, and so I want to show him thanks by doing something for him, but specifically by offering him a sacrifice. Now, these kind of sacrifices involved only burning a portion on the altar for God. And as I sort of mentioned before, the rest of the food was divided then between the priests who offered the sacrifice and the worshipers themselves. They received it back and they then ate it as a meal of holy fellowship. It's interesting that Philo says that this meal that they eat after the sacrifice is hosted by God. So even though the worshiper has brought the food, for example, he gave it to God, but God sort of gives it back to him, at least most of it, gives it back to him to have this meal of holy fellowship, to celebrate the blessings that God has given him. And this really forms the background of the Eucharist. The Eucharist being Holy Communion, literally in Greek, Eucharist means the great thanksgiving. It's a meal at giving thanks to God. So the peace offering represented, celebration of God's blessings, and alongside of that, the expression of one's hope that God will continue to be in one's life and giving those same kind of blessings. So sort of maintaining that relationship of blessing. And then finally, sin offerings. Sin offerings, I think, are the most obvious to us. They have to do with dealing with the problem of sin. However, they didn't, sort of in the common Western understanding of sin offerings, it involved kind of like taking out God's punishment on the animal, which when we step back, that's actually pretty absurd. Like, why would God be pleased because I'm killing a sheep instead of dying myself for my sins? Instead, the offering of a sin offering was, again, a gesture, this time an apologetic gesture, that the sinner was repentant and wanted God to come back into his life. Like, he recognizes that by his sin, he has, pushed God out of his life. But here is an offering saying, like, I'm sorry, come back into my life. In these offerings, a portion of the food would be burned on the altar, and then the rest of it would not be eaten by the worshiper, but by the priests, who were God's agents. And in the book, I talk about why that's important, but that might be getting down into the weeds here.
I suppose we'll leave some for people to go read. I think, I actually went back and forth on putting a question in there on that, and estimating the amount of time we'd have, I decided to leave it out. So it seems like we're on the same page there. But turning the page, not to mix the metaphor too much there, I want to start talking about how this relates to Christ's sacrifice, which is obviously of such great importance to all of us who call ourselves followers of Jesus. And so we've sketched this picture of ancient Near Eastern sacrifice and Old Testament sacrifice more specifically. Now, drilling into Christ's sacrifice, I want to talk about its relationship to the Mosaic sacrifice, Old Testament sacrifice, Mosaic being the law of Moses. You know that, obviously, but in case anyone got confused with that switch from Old Testament to Mosaic, talking about the same thing there. So you give kind of two concepts. One is failure and one is fulfillment, which conveniently has a bit of alliteration there. You're the one who is the poet. But so let's start with failure. What do you mean when you talk about the failure of the Mosaic or Old Testament sacrifices?
Yeah, well, as I mentioned before, sacrifices were symbolic gifts expressing a pledge of friendship. They represented a pledge on the part of the offerer that he or she would live a life that spiritually reflected the physical qualities of the offering. Again, something for them to read about in the book. But therein lies the problem. They were pledges. But obviously, a pledge is not the important thing. Actually, this just popped into my mind. But maybe some of you remember an old episode of Seinfeld, where Seinfeld was at the airport at the car rental desk. And the lady says, "We don't have your car." And he says, "But I made a reservation." She says, "I know you made a reservation, but we don't have your car." And he tries to explain to her, like, the important thing is not taking the reservation, but fulfilling the reservation. Like, that's the important thing. And here the same thing is true. Like with sacrifice, the important thing was not making the pledge. I mean, okay, that's nice to pledge that I'm going to, live a holy life toward God, that I'm going to, trust him and obey him, et cetera, et cetera. It's good to pledge that. But the most important thing is to follow through with actual, real obedience and faithfulness. And that's what didn't happen. Which is why in the prophets of the Old Testament, time and again, God rebukes Israel. He says, "I don't rebuke you for offering sacrifices because, you do that just fine. What I rebuke you for is not showing the qualities and following through on those commitments that you made symbolically by offering the sacrifice." Sacrifices just became a show of piety, as opposed to like a meaningful step in building an actual relationship of obedience to faithfulness, obedience and faithfulness to God. So that's the failure of Mosaic sacrifice. It didn't actually make people righteous. It didn't actually make them the kind of people that God wanted them to be. The fulfillment of sacrifice in Christ, first of all, is seen in the fact that Christ doesn't just offer a symbolic pledge, he offers the real thing. So he doesn't simply offer an animal that through its physical qualities represents a faithful life. He offers his own actual, totally faithful life to God the Father on our behalf. He is, of course, without sin from birth on. He is, in fact, obedient and faithful to the most extreme radical degree, facing the threat of, being ostracized by his people, being insulted, being beaten, being unjustly condemned and humiliated and nailed to a cross to die painfully in full sight of everyone. And he's naked, by the way. I mean, like, all of that, he faced it, but he didn't flinch in his obedience to God to the very end. And that's the meaning of his sacrifice, is that display of total devotion to the very end. It represents, first of all, his own faithfulness, but then he's offering it on our behalf, which means that he offers it also as a pledge of faithfulness on behalf of the new humanity that he's going to be drawing to himself. It's a pledge to the Father that all those who put their faith in him, all those who are joined to him through faith and baptism, that they will also strive for that life of holiness and faithfulness. And then he also promises to help us, and he strengthens us, and he gives us his Holy Spirit in order to do just that. So his fulfillment of sacrifice, I think I use these words, but I draw this distinction definitely in the book between salvation being transactional, like a matter of accounting, which is one explanation of Christ's sacrifice, that it sort of balanced the books, and then basically no more sacrifices to happen, and sacrifice is just something to put on the shelf and forget. Instead, from my point of view, from our Orthodox Christian point of view, the sacrifice of Christ in particular, and salvation in Christ is transformative. It's transformational. So through his sacrifice, he inaugurates a new sacrificial lifestyle for mankind, and he empowers us to give our lives to God, to offer our lives to God in the same way that he offered his life to God.
There's so much I want to touch on here, and I'll have to choose wisely because there's only so much time in the day. I think the most fruitful thing to jump on will be that idea of Christ's sacrifice. Now, I do think it's worth people thinking about what you said about on the failure side as well. We don't have to follow this rabbit trail, but specifically that it wasn't so much saying that sacrifices were bad, right? And I think that's often kind of the popular understanding. Sacrifice was bad, and then we've got this good thing now, and it's all great, which really makes it really difficult to put the Old and New Testament together in any meaningful way. But that, for what it's worth, people can chew on that in a bit. I appreciate your perspective there. What I want to highlight here is that idea, you got to transactional and transformational. And I think some people will be kind of familiar with that as an idea of maybe juxtaposing a common Protestant or Western view of soteriology or view of salvation and with a more Eastern Orthodox perspective. But before getting into that, because I don't think that will surprise them, but something that slightly surprised me in the book was your readiness to use words like sacrifice and substitution, maybe especially, within this concept of atonement, which again is another big word, a theologically laden one, which from my understanding is used maybe more in Protestant circles than in Orthodox circles. But I want to start with that idea. So in your view, this idea of substitution, it's something that often gets kind of poked at, especially in its penal variety of penal substitution, but just substitution in general. What is the correct view from obviously your perspective on the place of substitution in our understanding of salvation?
Yeah, so I mean, we would understand that term substitution in the sense of, or we could understand that term substitution in the sense of Christ offering on our behalf. I think that we would say more on our behalf rather than in our place. Yeah, so the idea of him offering a sacrifice in our place means that he does it and then it has nothing to do with us. His sacrifice has nothing to do with us. But when we say that Christ offered his sacrifice on our behalf, actually there's an ancient church father, Polycarp, who's one of the earliest and most famous Christian bishop martyrs from the 2nd century. He wrote an epistle, which we still have, in which he says that Jesus Christ is the earnest money of our righteousness. And that's actually what it says in Greek, the earnest money of our righteousness. If you think about earnest money is, you could also talk about a down payment, but it's a way when you make a pledge, specifically like if you're making a pledge to buy a house. If you make an offer on a house, you also have to put forward some earnest money, which is a demonstration that you're serious about this pledge. Likewise, when you take a loan from the bank, you need to have a down payment to show that you're serious about that pledge to repay the loan. Christ is that expression of seriousness on behalf of those human beings who put their faith in him. He's like the first offering that demonstrates a serious intention to just totally sell out to God and belong to God and die to sin. That's another way that St. Paul says it, die to sin in order to live for God. And so Christ, through his sacrifice, he inaugurates a way or a path of sacrifice for all of us then to follow, to take up our own crosses and follow him. The purpose of his cross is in order to enable us to take up our own crosses and follow him in offering to God that same obedience and faithfulness that he offered.
That's really helpful, and I think that idea of a down payment there in Polycarp's language is really interesting and something for people to think about. Again, these are huge concepts, so I hope that when people walk away from these videos, and I think this is something we should be doing in all areas, right, is taking what you're hearing here and then going and digesting that and chewing on that. We have no shortage of great ideas out there, but I think one of the best skills we could be cultivating, especially in this age where you can go from this podcast to the next podcast to the next podcast, is really sitting and thinking about these things, because I think that's a really deep well to draw from there as we think about salvation and the sacrifice of Christ as that down payment on righteousness. So that's really fascinating. Thank you for that. As we begin to turn the page to kind of the final area of sacrifice that I want to explore today, it's the idea of sacrifice in the Christian life. So we've gone from the ancient Near East to Israel to Christ's sacrifice, and now our sacrifices. There's two specific areas I want to highlight. You highlight a bunch of them. We won't be able to get to all of them. But the first idea is the sacrifices that we offer in our daily lives to conform ourselves more to the image of Christ. Then the second is the idea of worship as a sacrifice, with the Eucharist as the pinnacle there. If you want to break in between those, if you forget that's a lot to cover, I can add in that second part again. But those are the two areas I'd like to highlight here.
Sure. So, looking for a quote. Maybe I'll just have to riff a little bit. But so John Chrysostom talks about those sacrifices of daily life, and talks about them in just very relatable, down-to-earth terms. He says, when the mouth refuses to speak an insult against his, a neighbor, that's a sacrifice. When the eye, we can sort of modernize it, when the eye refuses to look at internet pornography, that's a sacrifice. But then he goes on to say it's not just the negatives, but it's also the positives. Like when the mouth speaks words of kindness and love, that's a sacrifice. When we choose to exercise patience rather than anger, that's also a sacrifice. So in all of these cases, it's possible to look at that idea of sacrifice and the sacrifice of obedience. St. Paul talks about the living sacrifice of obedience. It's possible to see that through the lens of the modern, distorted idea of sacrifice, this negative, cloud that we talked about before. And when you do that, it's just sort of like, it's so hard, like I have to control my tongue and I have to control my eyes and my ears and I can't do anything fun. And, like we just dwell on the difficulty of it. But the point of sacrifice as a concept that the New Testament authors and that the church fathers are using is to harness that festive, welcoming, happy vibe that sacrifice had throughout the ancient world. And to remind people that, look, when you do those hard things, like it's hard to prepare for a party. Like if you're going to have a party at your house, it's a lot of work to cook all that food or to buy all that food or to invite all the people and whatever, all that takes a lot of work. But, if you're inviting people you love, the work doesn't matter because like you enjoy having them in your life. Likewise, all of these things take effort. They take hard work. But if we focus on the fact that when we do these things, we're showing God that we want him in our life. And we have his promise that, Christ said, like, if a man hears my words and obeys them, then I will come to him with my Father and we will dwell in him. Like he actually says that in the Gospel of John. So when we obey God, we welcome him into our lives. And if you put it into that perspective, that's pretty motivating. Like you can overcome that sort of dread of the difficulty.
Yeah, and I love that idea of recapturing that ancient sense of celebration there, even though these things are difficult. And personally, the idea of a party being difficult to get ready for, but worth it, is something that resonates with me as I spent all day working on stuff for my wedding. That's coming up in 2 weeks. It's certainly a lot of work, but it is a great celebration. So if you think of sacrifice in that way, I think that's really intriguing. Well, I would like to just end with, before we go to the final four, that idea of worship as a sacrifice, and specifically the Eucharist as a sacrifice. I know that's a huge concept. We're only going to be able to kind of just touch on it here, but if you want to riff on that a little bit, I think that would be a wonderful place to end this.
Sure. Well, we did talk about the Eucharist in the context of the peace offerings, and I think that that again, remembering that when we come together to celebrate the Eucharist, it's not just about receiving Holy Communion. Now, for Protestants, that's not as much of a danger, kind of viewing it that way. But I think for Orthodox and Catholics, sometimes, we're so focused on receiving the sacrament, which is important. That's the means of receiving grace, that we miss the context, which is that we are gathered together as a body of Christ to offer our own pledge of commitment to God, and then to celebrate all of the blessings that he's given us, just like those ancient Israelite worshipers would do with the peace offering. And then one last thing about worship as a sacrifice. Again, the negative modern view versus the ancient joyful view. In modern times, like, worship feels like a sacrifice in the sense that I have to wake up early on a Sunday morning, or I, can't read the New York Times and have my, relaxing breakfast in my PJs, whatever. All these things that we have to give up, and we think, okay, I'll sacrifice for you, God. But, how long can we push ourselves to do it in those negative terms? But again, recognizing that time spent in worship, not just on Sundays, but every day, time spent in worship and prayer is a sacrifice in the sense of a meaningful gift to God. And one of the examples I use in the Bible actually might resonate with you, but I talk about how some of the most meaningful gifts that we give are utterly and completely impractical. And one of the reasons people come up with for not engaging in worship and prayer is like, oh, it's a waste of time. I've got so many things to do. How can I spend 15 minutes every morning in prayer? I have to clean the house. I have to pay the bills, et cetera, et cetera. But when we want to show someone we love them, for example, in your case, you buy a diamond ring. Like, what practical use is a diamond ring? And how much money, goes into for people around the world buying diamond rings for their, fiancés. I give some other examples like parachuting excursions. And, these things just like defy any practical rationale, but they are meaningful gifts because of that extravagance. And why can't we show God some extravagance by saying, okay, look, I have a million things to do, but I'm going to extravagantly spend 15 minutes in prayer every day.
Yeah, I love that. And I think that's such a great kind of devotional place to end on there. And I think people will really resonate with that from across many different experiences, whether that's parachuting or buying diamond rings or any number of things. And that was an unintentional rhyme, but maybe you're rubbing off on me here. We did not have time to talk about the celery today, but it is a fascinating children's book, and just the idea of monks writing children's books is something that excites me so much. And so just another plug for that as well as we wrap up here. But I always end the show with a segment that I call the Final Four, and it is, well, just that, the final 4 questions that go in quick succession as a way to kind of get to know the guest on maybe a bit more personal level, because some of the conversations can tend to be a bit ethereal or academic, and I think this is a fun way to end. So the first question that I ask all of my guests is, what has been the most fruitful habit or spiritual discipline in your life?
Confession with a priest.
Wonderful. The second question is, outside the Bible, what has been the most impactful book on your life?
Orthodoxy by Gk Chesterton.
Oh, okay. That's on my list of books I want to read this year. Have not gotten to it yet, but maybe I will bump it up a little further now because of that. So you can go back in time and you're having coffee with yourself right at the beginning of seminary there in 2001, if I got that right. What's one piece of advice you give him for his future as a priest and a monk?
Relax a little and trust God more.
Well said. All right, final question, and perhaps my favorite. This channel is called Gospel Simplicity, and it's often pointed out that the conversations can be a bit on the complex side. So I like to end by asking, in one sentence or so, what is the gospel?
The Son of God became a human in order to heal and strengthen our humanity so that we can live in fellowship with God.
Well, Father Jeremy, thank you so much. This has been a joy. And thanks to all of you who are watching this sometime in the future. And in that future, the book Welcoming Gifts will be out from Ancient Faith. The link will be in the description. And you've got a copy right there. And so be sure to check that out. Well, Thank you all for your time. I'll close as I always do by saying until next time, be on the lookout for more videos, but far more importantly than that, go out and love God and love others, because truly, above all else, that will change the world.